I was struck by a short-term political event and a longer-term line of argument about us. The short-term political event was the rise of the Tea Party. And at the beginning of the book, I thanked the Tea Party for encouraging us to look back to our past for inspiration and for understanding. Then I proceed to criticize the Tea Party's view of our history because my view is quite different than theirs. But I think at the heart of our debate right now is a debate about who we are. And we can't agree on who we are because we can't agree on who we've been. And so I argue that if you look at our founding documents, at the argument over the Constitution, at the early years of our republic, you see this balance pop up all the time. I would just ask you, what is the first word of the Constitution of the United States? The first word of the Constitution of the United States is the word we. We, the people of the United States, and the preamble describes a series of goals for government, including providing for the general welfare. I always like to point out that welfare is right there in the first paragraph of the Constitution of the United States. And it's a series of common goals. The first word isn't I. And the preamble talks about ensuring liberty for ourselves and our posterity, not myself and my posterity, ourselves and our posterity. Or if you take a look at the Declaration, at the beginning, we all remember that we have from our Creator, we've been endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A strong declaration on behalf of liberty. The very last part of the Declaration of Independence is where our founders pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to achieving the goals of the Declaration. This was, our founders realized that these great things had to be achieved together. We couldn't achieve them simply as individuals. I also like to point out that if you remember all that great list of complaints Jefferson has in the Declaration, he doesn't get to taxes till number 17. And then even then he doesn't argue that we shouldn't have any taxes. He just talks about our lack of say and how we were taxed. The first several complaints are about the king not allowing us to govern ourselves. These were not anti-government zealots, our founders. Similarly, I argue that the Constitution was conceived in balance and that the Constitution contains competing values. The Constitution also involved a whole series of compromises, including on the great and fundamental issue of slavery. And that if you wonder what sense are we to make of originalism as a way of reading the Constitution, I point out in the book that within 3 years of its adoption, its two leading authors and interpreters, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, disagreed on whether establishing a Bank of the United States was constitutional. So I would just ask if the original guys who wrote the original document and wrote the original interpretation of it in the Federalist don't agree on its original meaning, what are we to make of the idea of originalism? And I go on from there to talk about government. I try to be careful to say that government is not the same as community, but I do think that government is often called upon to, in a democratic society, in a free republic, to represent the interests of community, to express what we as a community think should be the law of the land and the values of the country. And I argue that if you believe that government had little role in building us up as a country, you have to read Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay, and Abraham Lincoln, among others, out of the first 100 years of American history. I'm happy to talk about that some more. Now, what does all this have to do with now? Well, I believe that our friends in the Tea Party are looking back to what is an unusual period, an exceptional period, if you will, in our history, the period of the Gilded Age, roughly from the end of the Civil War to the rise of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, where we were indeed a country much taken by the idea of radical individualism. It was the period when social Darwinism was in vogue, and the idea that the survival of the fittest could actually serve us well as a social philosophy. We went through the Gilded Age. There was a lot of economic creativity in that period, it should be said. But the country wasn't happy with it. And out of that period came both the populist and progressive movements, which I argue in the book, when they came together in the first decade of the 20th century, overthrew this period of radical individualism. Now, many argue that the progressives and the populists and later the New Dealers and the Great Society folks were really breaking with our past and creating a period of big government. But if you read our national story, as I do, which I believe, obviously I wrote the book, so I think it's the right way to read our national story, then you see the progressives and the populists and the New Dealers not as simply innovators, although they were innovative, but as actually restorationists. They restored the great American balance between government and the market, between individualism and community. And we've really been governed under a kind of long consensus that they established. And I think that we face a very difficult political argument now because for the first time, our friends in the conservative movement have been building toward this, but they have never, to the degree they have in the last 5 years, adopted radical individualism as central to their view. Indeed, in the book, I speak rather fondly of those forms of conservatism that emphasize community. And I even have some good things to say about compassionate conservatism. I don't know if Mike Gerson is going to come in to talk to the class, but Mike Gerson, who worked for President Bush, I told Mike once I didn't realize how much I like compassionate conservatives until you guys almost completely disappeared. And I think that what you're seeing now is an effort to sort of push any idea of compassionate conservatism off to the side and push away the communitarian tendencies within conservatism. I like to remind people that William F. Buckley Jr., who, as many of you know, was in many ways the founder of modern conservatism, wrote toward the end of his life a very important book, I thought, called Gratitude, where he argued that those of us who grew up in this country with its protection, with its nurturing, owed something back to the country, a kind of communitarian conservative idea. I do think that if Bill Buckley, the founder of modern conservatism, tried to run in a Republican primary right now on the basis of the book Gratitude, he'd lose the primary.